Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere deeply unsettling. Your kitchen. Specifically, the American kitchen of the 1950s, where a group of very determined corporations looked at butter, real, golden, honest butter, and said, no, we can do worse than this. And then they did. Tonight we're talking about margarine, how it was invented, how it was marketed, and how it quietly replaced the foods your great-grandmother actually cooked with, one pastel-coloured advertisement at a time. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and a very warm thank you to the viewer who suggested this one. You know who you are, and you clearly have strong feelings about fats, which I respect. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always somehow 3 a.m. somewhere, and I find that deeply comforting. Also, we now live on Spotify. The link is in the description if you'd like to drift off there instead. Now dim the lights, switch on a fan, pull your blanket up, and get comfortable. Really comfortable. You're going to need it. Because tonight we are entering the golden age of processed food, and I use the word golden very loosely, because almost nothing about what we're discussing is actually golden. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered how margarine, a product originally invented to fatten up geese, ended up on every breakfast table in America? Did 1950s housewives actually prefer it? Or were they just told to until they believed it? What exactly is in a tub of margarine? And why did it sometimes come with a little packet of yellow dye you had to knead in yourself like some kind of cursed arts and crafts project? How did the dairy industry, the people who had butter, somehow lose to the people who had hydrogenated vegetable oil and a very large advertising budget? And why did Heart Healthy end up on a product that was, by most modern accounts, significantly worse for your heart than the thing it replaced? Congratulations! You've just woken up in 1953, there's a tub of margarine on your kitchen counter, a cigarette company is sponsoring your favourite television programme, and your doctor has just told you that fat, specifically the kind found in butter, eggs and meat, is trying to kill you. Everything you're about to spread on your toast is a lie. Good morning. Long before it appeared in American refrigerators dressed up in cheerful yellow packaging, margarine had a rather unglamorous origin story, one that involved a French emperor, a competition to feed soldiers cheaply, and a product so unappealing that its inventor had to market it primarily to the military because no one else wanted it. The year was 1869. Napoleon III, Emperor of France, was running a country with a practical problem. Butter was expensive, the military was large, and the working classes were hungry. He offered a prize, actual government money, to anyone who could develop a cheap, stable fat substitute that could be produced at scale and wouldn't go rancid in a soldier's pack. A chemist named Hippolyte Mejmouriès accepted the challenge. What he produced was called oleomargarine, a pale, semi-solid mixture made primarily from beef tallow, skimmed milk, and chopped cow udder, which he churned together in a process that produced something vaguely butter-shaped and approximately butter-coloured, if you squinted in dim light and had never tasted butter. You're not, at this point in the story, meant to be impressed. Mejmouriès patented his creation and sold the rights to a Dutch company, Jurgens, which would eventually become part of the Unilever empire. A fact that should perhaps alarm you in ways you're not fully awake enough to process right now. The early product bore almost no resemblance to what would eventually be sold to American housewives. It was dense, waxy, often greyish, and had the kind of smell that suggested something had gone only partly right. It did not taste good. It was not marketed as tasting good. It was marketed as being inexpensive and not immediately fatal, which in 1870s Europe was actually a fairly competitive value proposition. The United States first encountered margarine in the 1870s, when manufacturers began producing their own versions using a mixture of animal fats and vegetable oils. The product, arrived into an America that was simultaneously post-Civil War, rapidly industrializing, and deeply interested in cheap food for a growing urban workforce. For a brief optimistic moment, margarine sold well, not because anyone loved it, but because large numbers of people could not reliably afford butter and needed something to put on bread that wasn't just the bread itself. This is the part of the origin story that tends to get left out of the golden-toned television advertisements of the 1950s. Margarine was not invented because a scientist had a dream about healthier hearts. It was invented because Napoleon needed to provision an army on a budget. It was sold initially to soldiers, to sailors, to factory workers, to anyone whose food options were constrained not by preference, but by economic reality. It was the product you chose when you couldn't afford the real thing, and it wore that reputation for decades like a coat it couldn't quite get off. The transition from military ration to domestic staple would take the better part of a century and require a combination of 2 world wars, an organised advertising industry, and a convenient scientific controversy about the human heart. But in 1869, standing in his French laboratory with a vat of beef tallow and a government prize at stake, Mej Mauriès could not have imagined any of that. He was simply trying to solve a problem. The problem was hunger. The solution was margarine. And like a great many solutions that begin in wartime and end up in peacetime kitchens, nobody stopped to ask whether it was actually a good idea once the emergency had passed. The cow udder, for what it's worth, was eventually removed from the recipe. This was considered an improvement. If someone had sat the average 1950s housewife down and explained step by step what was actually happening inside a margarine factory, the industrial extraction, the chemical hydrogenation, the deodorization of oils that smelled before processing, deeply alarming. It's possible she might have reconsidered her position on butter. It is also possible she would have reconsidered her position on eating entirely. The process began with vegetable oils, cottonseed, soybean, corn, or some combination thereof, which were extracted from their source materials using heat, pressure, and in many cases chemical solvents. The oil that emerged from this process was not golden and fragrant. It was pale, sometimes murky, and carried an odour that one contemporary description charitably called unpleasant, and that we might more honestly describe as the smell of something that has not yet been convinced to become food. This is where hydrogenation entered the picture. Hydrogenation is a chemical process developed in the early 1900s that involves pumping hydrogen gas through liquid vegetable oil in the presence of a metal catalyst, usually nickel. The hydrogen bonds to the fat molecules and causes the oil to solidify, transforming something that pours into something that spreads. It is, in the most literal sense, the industrial conversion of a liquid into a solid through chemistry. The margarine industry found this extremely useful. Butter was solid at room temperature. Margarine needed to be solid at room temperature. Hydrogenation solved that problem neatly, and it also extended shelf life, which manufacturers found even more appealing than they let on publicly. What hydrogenation also produced, as a byproduct that no one in 1950 was particularly eager to discuss, was trans fatty acids. These are a form of unsaturated fat that does not occur in significant quantities in nature, and that the human body, encountering them, processes in ways that were not fully understood at the time and would not be fully understood for several more decades. The research, when it eventually arrived, would be uncomfortable. But in the 1950s the research had not yet arrived, and the margarine was already in the tub. After hydrogenation, the oil went through a process called deodorization, essentially industrial steam cleaning, to remove the residual smell. Then it was bleached to correct the colour, which was, naturally, not the warm golden yellow of butter, but a greyish white that tested poorly with consumers. Then, in states where it was legally permitted, yellow dye was added, then emulsifiers to maintain texture, then preservatives to maintain shelf life, then artificial flavouring to approximate the taste of the dairy product it was replacing. By the time your 1950s tub of margarine reached the grocery store dairy case, it had passed through more industrial processes than most of the other products on the shelf put together. None of this was hidden, exactly. The ingredients were listed. The processes were patented and therefore technically public. But the advertising, warm, domestic, confident, and thoroughly focused on the words heart healthy and modern, was not in the habit of describing what happened between the soybean and the breakfast table. There was a reason for that. The reason was that the journey was not one that made most people feel better about the destination. Butter, by contrast, involved a cow and a churn. This was considered old-fashioned. Progress in the 1950s kitchen was measured in steps away from the farm and toward the factory, and margarine had taken considerably more of them than almost anything else on the shelf. For most of American history, butter was not a product anyone felt the need to defend. It existed. It tasted good. It came from cows. The idea that it would one day need a public relations campaign to survive against a competitor made from cottonseed oil would have seemed, to any self-respecting dairy farmer of the 1930s, completely insane. Butter had been a fixture of American domestic life since before there was an American domestic life to speak of. Colonial households churned it. Pioneer women carried it across the Oregon Trail in the same wagon as their children and their Bibles. It appeared in recipes handed down through generations, not because it was the only option, but because it was the correct one, and the distinction between those two things had never previously seemed worth articulating. The dairy industry's confidence was, in retrospect, its primary vulnerability. When margarine first appeared in the 1870s, the initial reaction was not alarm but contempt. Butter producers and their political allies in state legislatures moved swiftly to restrict margarine through regulation, adding taxes, requiring labelling, and in several states banning the yellow colouring that made margarine look convincingly like its competitor. These were the actions of an industry that was annoyed, not frightened. The underlying assumption was that no one who had tasted real butter would willingly choose the alternative. That assumption held more or less for about 60 years. What changed was not the butter. The butter remained exactly what it had always been, a natural fat, rich and golden, produced by churning cream. What changed was the context around it. By the 1940s and 50s, American food culture was in the middle of a quiet revolution that the dairy industry had not anticipated and was not organized to resist. The revolution was not about flavor. It was about science, or more precisely about the appearance of science, the reassuring authority of men in white coats, of research citations in advertisements, of an official-sounding organization recommending that you make different choices than your grandmother had made. Butter had no white coat. Butter had no research program. Butter had cows and cream, and a history that stretched back past memory, and in the 1950s that turned out to be insufficient marketing. The dairy industry was structured around production, not persuasion. Its farmers knew how to raise cattle and manage pastures. They did not know, and had never needed to know, how to counter a well-funded nutritional argument in the pages of a women's magazine or on a 30-second television spot. The industry would eventually learn. By the 1980s and 90s, dairy councils had advertising campaigns, lobbying arms, and their own nutritional research. But by then the damage was substantial. An entire generation of American consumers had been raised to associate butter with something their doctor had told them to use less of, and that association, once formed in childhood, does not dissolve easily. The confidence that butter required no defense turned out to be exactly the kind of confidence that loses the argument quietly, over decades, while the other side is taking out advertisements. You rarely notice you're losing a cultural battle until you look up and realize your product is now the thing that the health-conscious person at the grocery store is quietly putting back on the shelf. The dairy industry did not take the arrival of margarine quietly. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, butter lobbyists pushed through some of the most aggressively specific laws in American legislative history, laws so detailed, so petty, and so thoroughly committed to inconveniencing margarine manufacturers that you almost have to admire the dedication. This was not passive resistance. This was a legislative campaign waged with the energy of people who believed correctly that their entire way of life was under commercial threat, and who had decided that if margarine was going to exist, it was going to exist in the most inconvenient possible form. The Federal Margarine Act of 1886 was the opening salvo. It imposed a tax on margarine, 2 cents per pound for the uncoloured variety, 10 cents per pound if it was coloured yellow. The tax was not designed to raise revenue. It was designed to make margarine expensive enough that its price advantage over butter would evaporate. For a product whose entire appeal was that it cost less, this was a targeted and fairly sophisticated attack. Manufacturers responded by selling the product white and including a separate packet of yellow dye for consumers to mix in themselves. The dairy lobby responded to this workaround by pushing for laws in several states that banned yellow dye entirely, in some cases requiring margarine to be sold pink, on the theory that no one would voluntarily put a pink substance on their toast. You're not misreading that. There were states in America where margarine was legally required to be an unsettling colour, specifically to discourage people from buying it. New Hampshire mandated pink margarine until 1967. Vermont had similar legislation. The dairy states of Wisconsin and Minnesota held out against the legalization of coloured margarine well into the post-war era, which meant that residents who wanted yellow margarine would sometimes drive across state lines to purchase it, a level of commitment to spreadable fat that says something about either the product or the people, and possibly both. The legal battles were constant and exhausting. Margarine manufacturers challenged the colouring laws, dairy interests defended them, courts issued rulings, legislatures responded with new restrictions. By the early 20th century, at least 32 states had enacted some form of anti-margarine legislation, ranging from colouring requirements to outright bans on sale to private households. The federal government, meanwhile, maintained its tax structure, and inspectors were employed specifically to ensure that manufacturers were not secretly pre-colouring product and selling it at the uncoloured tax rate. What is remarkable about this period in retrospect is not that the dairy industry fought so hard, that is entirely understandable, but that it fought primarily on legislative rather than culinary grounds. The argument being made was not butter tastes better, here is why, let us remind you. The argument was margarine should be as inconvenient to buy and use as we can legally make it. This strategy worked roughly until the circumstances changed, until wartime butter shortages meant that even inconvenient margarine was better than no fat at all, and until a generation of consumers had grown accustomed enough to the product that the pink colouring mandate started to look less like consumer protection and more like the dairy lobby throwing a slow-motion tantrum in legislative form. Which, to be fair, is largely what it was. For a significant stretch of the early 20th century, margarine was legally required to be sold white, the colour of lard, of cold shortening, of something you would perhaps use to waterproof a boot, but would not voluntarily spread on a piece of toast. The solution the margarine companies arrived at was, in retrospect, extraordinary. They included a small capsule of yellow dye inside the package and asked the consumer to mix it in herself. This product was called Colour Pack Margarine, which is a very dignified name for what was essentially a bag of white fat, with a homework assignment attached. The process worked as follows. You purchased your margarine, which arrived in a thick plastic pouch or waxed wrapper, pallid and solid and faintly dispiriting. Inside was a small gelatin or foil capsule containing orange-yellow food dye. Before you could use your margarine, before it could pass as something a reasonable person might put on bread, you had to pop the capsule, release the dye into the surrounding fat, and then knead the package by hand until the colour was evenly distributed. This took several minutes of sustained squeezing and folding. The result, if you did it correctly, was something approximately butter-coloured. If you did it incorrectly, or gave up halfway through from sheer existential fatigue, you had streaky margarine, which looked like something had gone wrong at the factory, which in a philosophical sense it had. The colour pack system was not considered normal at the time. It was widely understood to be a concession to dairy industry lobbying, a legal workaround to restrictions that everyone acknowledged were designed not to protect consumers but to protect market share. Housewives mixed the dye. Children were sometimes recruited to help squeeze the package, which manufacturers attempted to frame as a fun activity. There are food historians who suggest the kneading task was genuinely enjoyed by some households, particularly children who found the squishing satisfying in the way that all squishing is satisfying to a child. But the broader consensus was that it was an inconvenience, and that the inconvenience was the point. By the late 1940s and early 50s, states began repealing their colouring restrictions. The repeal was gradual, a state here, a state there, driven partly by post-war changes in consumer behaviour and partly by the political reality that margarine was now so widely consumed that continuing to make it a bizarre craft project was becoming difficult to justify publicly. Federal restrictions on coloured margarine were lifted in 1950. Wisconsin characteristically held out until 1967. What was lost when the colour pack era ended, and this is not a thing anyone mourned at the time, was a small, involuntary moment of honesty in the transaction between manufacturer and consumer. Every time a housewife needed that dye packet, she was implicitly acknowledging that the product in her hands was not butter, had never been butter, and required active intervention to look like butter. The removal of that step, the arrival of pre-coloured, ready-to-spread margarine that sat in the dairy case looking almost identical to what it was designed to replace, removed the last visible friction from the substitution. After that, you had to read the label to know the difference, and not everyone read the label. Margarine had spent decades being the product that lost. It lost court cases, it lost shelf space, it lost the colour yellow. And then, in the early 1940s, something happened that no amount of dairy lobbying could have anticipated. A world war made butter genuinely scarce, and American households were suddenly asked to make do. Rationing began in 1943. Butter was among the first products restricted. The military needed fats, the supply chains were disrupted, and the farms that had been producing cream for civilian churns were redirected toward other priorities. The average American household received a fraction of the butter it had previously consumed, and the fraction was not large enough to cover the bread. Into this gap stepped margarine. Not triumphantly, there was nothing triumphant about the circumstances, but practically, it was available, it was unrationed, or rationed less severely, it was cheap. And for millions of American households navigating the particular domestic arithmetic of wartime, fewer resources, the same mouths to feed, a general cultural directive to make do and not complain, margarine moved from the category of things we buy when we can't afford butter to the category of things we buy because butter is not available. That distinction matters. The first category carries a social stigma. The second carries a sense of shared sacrifice, and shared sacrifice in wartime America was not shameful. It was patriotic. The housewives who switched to margarine during the war were not making a permanent statement about their preferences. They were managing a shortage. But something happened during those years of management that the dairy industry had not counted on. A generation of children grew up eating margarine. They grew up tasting it at breakfast, at dinner, on the rolls served at family meals. They did not experience it as a substitute for something better because they had no reference point for the something better. For them, margarine was simply what the spread at meals tasted like. By the time rationing ended and butter returned to shelves in quantity, these children were adolescents. In another decade, they would be young adults setting up their own households, and some of them would buy margarine not because butter was unavailable, and not because it was significantly cheaper, though it was, but because it was familiar, because it tasted like home, or at least like the wartime version of home that was the only version they had. Food companies understood this. The post-war advertising push for margarine was not aimed solely at the generation of women who had used it during the war and might be persuaded to keep using it out of habit. It was aimed equally at creating permanent customers from the children who had grown up during the shortage. Children who could be told, credibly, that this was not a wartime compromise but a modern choice, a better choice, a choice that science endorsed and their grandmothers simply hadn't known about yet. The war did not make margarine good. It made margarine normal, and in consumer behaviour, normal is almost always more powerful than good. Somewhere in the 1940s and 50s, a new kind of expert entered the American kitchen, not a chef, not a nutritionist in any meaningful sense, but a food scientist. A person whose job was to take a cheap industrial ingredient and make it behave like something people actually wanted to eat. They were very good at their jobs, which is either impressive or disturbing, depending on how you feel about the texture of processed cheese. Food science as a discipline had existed since the early 20th century, but it was the post-war era that gave it scale, funding, and purpose. The purpose was to take the industrial capacity America had built during the war, the manufacturing infrastructure, the chemical processing plants, the large-scale agricultural supply chains, and direct it toward the peacetime consumer market. The question was not whether this could be done. The question was what it would take to make Americans eat the result. Margarine presented food scientists with a specific and well-defined challenge. It needed to taste like butter. Not exactly like butter. That turned out to be chemically quite difficult because the flavour compounds in butter are numerous and complex and the product of biological processes that are not straightforwardly replicated in a factory. But close enough. Close enough that a consumer spreading it on toast in the morning, before she was fully awake, would not register a strong sense that something was missing. Diacetyl, a compound that occurs naturally in butter and gives it a characteristic creamy flavour, was identified and added artificially. Emulsifiers were used to approximate butter's smooth, consistent texture. Salt was added at precisely calibrated levels. The goal was a product that would not lose a blind taste test against its competition by a wide margin, which is a more modest ambition than it sounds, and one that was largely achieved by the mid-1950s. What food scientists could not replicate was the cooking behaviour. Butter browns. It develops complex flavours when heated, a process called the Maillard reaction, and a secondary process called browning of milk solids, which produce the nutty, rich quality that makes sautéed vegetables and pan sauces taste the way they do. Margarine, being primarily vegetable fat with water and emulsifiers, does not do this. It melts, and it occasionally separates, and it produces a result that is technically food, but is missing something in the register that experienced cooks recognized and could not quite name in scientific terms, but understood perfectly well in sensory ones. The industry's response to this limitation was characteristically practical. They did not fix it. they redirected. Margarine was positioned not as a cooking fat, but as a spread, a product you used at the table, on bread and toast and muffins, where the absence of browning behavior was irrelevant, and the presence of something yellow and soft was sufficient. The television advertisement showed margarine being spread, not cooked. The recipes in corporate cookbooks called for it in applications where the distinction between butter and its replacement was least legible. Food science could not make margarine behave like butter in a hot pan. It could, however, make sure that most consumers never had occasion to test that. In the 1950s, a physiologist named Ansel Keys published research suggesting a direct link between dietary fat, specifically saturated fat, and heart disease. His conclusions were disputed by other scientists at the time, his methodology questioned, and his data accused of being selectively chosen. None of this prevented his ideas from becoming the nutritional gospel of the next 4 decades. Keys was a formidable man, energetic, confident, and possessed of the particular certainty that distinguishes a scientist who believes he has found something important from one who is merely cautious. He had done significant work during the war on the physiology of starvation and was taken seriously by the medical establishment. When he turned his attention to heart disease, which was rising sharply in post-war America and killing men in alarming numbers, people listened. His central study, known as the 7-country study, examined the diets and cardiovascular outcomes of populations across 7 nations, and found what appeared to be a correlation between the consumption of saturated fat and rates of heart disease. Countries where people ate more saturated fat had more heart disease. Countries where they ate less had less. The conclusion Keys drew, that saturated fat caused heart disease and should be replaced with polyunsaturated fat, was presented with a clarity and confidence that made the underlying complexity of the evidence less visible than it perhaps should have been. The criticism was substantive. Scientists, including John Yudkin, argued that sugar, not fat, was the more likely dietary culprit in rising rates of heart disease. Others pointed out that Keys had data from 22 countries in his original analysis, and had published results from only 7, the 7 that most clearly supported his hypothesis. The relationship between diet and cardiovascular disease, critics noted, was likely mediated by dozens of variables that a cross-national comparison could not control for. These objections were not fringe positions. They appeared in peer-reviewed journals. They were made by credentialed scientists with their own research programs. They lost in the short term with a thoroughness that is still somewhat stunning to examine. Keys was a gifted polemicist as well as a researcher, and he attacked his critics with a vigour that tended to discourage further engagement. The nutritional consensus of the 1960s and 70s hardened around his framework. Saturated fat was dangerous, polyunsaturated fat was safer, and the practical implication was that Americans should replace butter with margarine. This was a remarkable outcome for a body of evidence that remained at its foundations significantly more contested than its public presentation suggested. What Keys's work gave the margarine industry was something it had been unable to manufacture for itself, a scientific justification. The product had always been cheaper, now it was healthier. That combination, presented with sufficient confidence, turned out to be very difficult for butter to argue against. By the late 1950s, the American Heart Association had begun recommending that Americans reduce their intake of saturated fats and replace them with polyunsaturated alternatives. Margarine, which was made primarily from vegetable oils, was exactly the kind of product this recommendation pointed toward. Margarine companies noticed this immediately and began citing the American Heart Association in their advertising, with a frequency and enthusiasm that the organization had perhaps not fully anticipated. The HA recommendation was not, in the fine print, an endorsement of margarine specifically. It was a general dietary guideline about fat types, produced in response to the growing body of research, contested as we've established but growing, around saturated fat and cardiovascular disease. The distinction between a dietary guideline and an endorsement of this specific tub of yellow spread is the kind of distinction that survives peer review but does not always survive contact with a 30-second television commercial. What the American Heart Association provided functionally was the authority of medicine applied to a purchasing decision. Butter had been part of the American diet since before the country existed. It required no defense because it required no justification. It was simply food, in the way that all traditional foods are simply food, present before anyone thought to ask whether they were a good idea. The HA recommendation changed the terms. Suddenly, the choice between butter and margarine was framed not as a question of taste or preference or tradition, but as a question of health, a question with a correct answer, provided by medical experts, backed by research, in the interest of your cardiovascular system. This framing was enormously advantageous to the margarine industry and enormously difficult for the dairy industry to counter. You cannot argue against medical authority with the claim that your product tastes better. Taste is subjective. Death is not. When a credentialed organization in white coats tells the American public that one product is associated with heart disease and another is not, the flavor profile of the first product becomes, from a marketing standpoint, largely irrelevant. The AHA's involvement also gave margarine manufacturers something they had been lacking since the product's inception: moral legitimacy. Margarine was no longer the cheap substitute for people who couldn't afford the real thing. It was the responsible choice for people who cared about their health and the health of their families. The woman who chose margarine over butter was not being thrifty. She was being conscientious. She was listening to her doctor. She was doing what the science said. That reframing from economically constrained to medically informed was among the most significant events in the history of the product, and it was accomplished not by the margarine industry directly, but by a well-meaning medical organization whose primary concern was cardiovascular disease, and whose secondary effect was to transform the breakfast table of an entire nation. The 1950s housewife did not discover margarine by accident. She was introduced to it carefully and repeatedly through one of the most powerful new tools in American commercial history, the television set. Food advertising on television in this era was not subtle. It was enthusiastic, domestic, and relentless, arriving directly into the living room during programs the whole family watched together. By 1955, the majority of American homes had a television. By 1960, it was almost universal. The companies that understood earliest what this meant for consumer behavior, that you could now show a product being used, in motion, in color, by a smiling woman in a clean kitchen, directly in front of the person you wanted to buy it, were the companies that reshaped the American pantry. Margarine was ideally suited to television advertising for several reasons. It was a product used daily, which meant the advertising reinforced a habit, rather than trying to create a one-time purchase. It was visually straightforward. A woman opening a tub, spreading something golden on toast or corn on the cob, and that simplicity translated well to a medium where 30 seconds was a long time. And it had, by the mid-1950s, acquired the AHA-adjacent health narrative that gave advertisers something more interesting to say than simply it's cheaper. You could say it was better for your family. You could say a doctor recommended it. You could show a healthy, happy, attractive family eating breakfast together, and in the background, on the kitchen table, there was the tub. The housewife herself was central to this advertising. Not the actual housewife. Complicated, tired, managing a household on a budget that the television commercials never quite depicted accurately, but the idealized version, calm, competent, approachable, deeply invested in the nutritional well-being of her family and entirely willing to update her purchasing behavior in response to new scientific information. This woman chose margarine not because her husband told her to or because it was on sale, but because she had done her research and made an informed decision. She was presented as an autonomous consumer, even as the advertising was working precisely to limit her autonomy by making one answer seem obviously correct. The kitchen in these advertisements was always clean, the light was warm, the children were well behaved, the husband was grateful, the margarine gleamed in its tub. What the advertisements did not show, the margarine factory, the hydrogenation process, the deodorization tanks, the dye that had until recently required manual incorporation, was absent from every frame. What was present, consistently and powerfully, was the image of a modern household making a modern choice, and the implication, never stated outright, that women who were still buying butter were behind the times in a way that quietly reflected on their character as homemakers. Television made margarine aspirational. That is perhaps the most remarkable thing about it. A product invented to provision a 19th century army, made from industrially processed vegetable oil that had spent decades being legally required to be pink in certain states, this product became, through the medium of the 30-second television spot, something a woman might feel good about choosing. Something that said, "I am informed, I am modern, I am taking care of my family the right way." The television did not cause this transformation alone, but it accelerated it in ways that print advertising never could have. You did not read about the modern housewife choosing margarine. You watched her do it in your living room while your own dinner was on the stove. One of the most effective tricks in the margarine marketer's playbook was the word modern. Butter, in this framing, was old-fashioned, something your grandmother used because she didn't know better, because science hadn't yet arrived in her kitchen. Margarine was what a forward-thinking woman chose, a product of progress, of research, of the same gleaming post-war optimism that had given America the dishwasher and the automatic washing machine. The word appeared everywhere in print advertisements, on packaging, in the taglines of television spots that opened with shots of laboratories and closed with shots of breakfast tables. Modern families choose margarine. It sounds almost quaint now. In 1955, it landed with the full weight of a culture that had just won a world war using science, and was not inclined to be skeptical about where science was pointing next. The post-war period was, in the broader sense, an era of institutional trust. Americans trusted their doctors, their government, their food manufacturers, and the emerging class of nutritional experts who appeared in magazines and on television to tell them what to eat. This trust was not naive. It had been largely earned, through a war effort that had genuinely required and rewarded collective confidence and expertise. But it created conditions in which a well-positioned authority could reshape consumer behavior with relatively little friction. The margarine industry understood this and deployed the language of progress accordingly. What made the modern framing particularly effective was that it positioned the consumer, not the product, as the subject of the advertisement. You were not being asked to evaluate margarine on its merits. You were being asked to evaluate yourself. Were you the kind of woman who clung to tradition out of habit, or the kind who updated her practices in response to new information? Were you making choices based on what your mother did, or based on what the science now said? The implied answer, and the product that answered it correctly, was never in doubt. Margarine was right. Butter was the past. And no one in 1956 wanted to be caught living in the past, particularly not in the kitchen, where a woman's modernity was considered, by the advertising industry at least, to be most legibly on display. Butter had centuries of use behind it, and no advertising budget to speak of. It could not call itself modern because it was transparently ancient. It could not position itself as the product of scientific progress because it was the product of a biological process that predated science entirely. Every advantage that butter had, its depth of flavour, its long culinary history, the fact that every cook from every tradition in every country that kept cows had independently arrived at it as indispensable, was reframed in the margarine advertisement as evidence of its obsolescence. There was also a class dimension to the modern framing that operated below the surface of the advertisements, but shaped their effectiveness considerably. To call butter old-fashioned was to associate it, subtly, with the habits of women who had not been educated out of them, women who were still doing things the way they had always been done because no one had told them differently. The woman who chose margarine was implicitly a woman who followed developments in nutrition, who kept up. Taste was presented not as a legitimate criterion for food choice, but as a sentimental attachment that the truly modern homemaker had learned to set aside in favour of something more important: her family's health, her doctor's recommendation, and the quiet satisfaction of being on the right side of history. This was a remarkable piece of persuasion. It didn't argue that margarine tasted as good as butter. It argued that caring about the taste was the wrong way to approach the question, and in doing so it removed the one criterion on which butter would have won the comparison easily, without contest, before the first word of the advertisement had been read. Once the yellow dye restriction was lifted state by state, in a long and undignified legislative retreat that the dairy industry would rather forget, margarine companies moved quickly to make their product look as much like butter as legally possible. This was not subtle. The tubs were yellow, the wrapping was gold-toned, the brand names were soft and pastoral. The typefaces suggested farms and sunlight and the kind of wholesome rural authenticity that the product's actual manufacturing process could not have been further from. If you had arrived from another planet and been asked to identify the natural product and the industrial one based solely on packaging design, there is a reasonable chance you would have chosen incorrectly. That was the intention. Packaging design in the 1950s was not the afterthought it might appear in retrospect. It was a discipline taken seriously by the companies that understood the grocery store shelf as a communication medium, a place where a product had approximately 3 seconds to make an impression on a shopper, moving past it with a cart and a list and several children tugging at her coat. The margarine companies hired designers who understood colour psychology, who knew that gold and yellow communicated richness and naturalness and the warmth of dairy associations, and who applied those colours to a product that had been, until very recently, legally required to be white or pink. The naming conventions were equally deliberate: parquet, blue bonnet, imperial, country morning. These names did not say hydrogenated vegetable oil spread. They said fields, they said countryside, they said the kind of uncomplicated agricultural goodness that the product had precisely no connection to. Country morning was not made in the country in the morning. It was made in a factory using industrial processes by workers operating hydrogenation equipment. But country morning was what it was called, and country morning was what the woman at the grocery store saw when she reached for the product, and the associations that name triggered were the associations the company had paid significant money to trigger. The physical form of the packaging was itself a competitive move. Butter came in sticks, wrapped in waxed paper, sold in boxes of 4. Margarine began to appear in tubs, wide, soft-sided containers that sat open-faced in the refrigerator and could be accessed with a knife without unwrapping anything. The tub was more convenient than the stick. It was ready to use immediately. It sat on the breakfast table without requiring transfer to a butter dish. These were small practical advantages, but in the daily friction of household management, small practical advantages accumulate. The tub did not make margarine taste better. It made it easier to use, and ease of use over years of daily breakfasts becomes indistinguishable from preference. The dairy industry watched all of this with the particular frustration of an establishment player watching a newer competitor adopt its aesthetics. Butter did not look like margarine. It looked like butter, which was to say, it looked like what it was, which had always seemed sufficient and now suddenly seemed insufficient. The gold foil wrappers and pastoral names of the margarine tubs were, in a sense, a form of flattery, an acknowledgement that butter's visual identity carried genuine appeal, and that the most efficient way to compete with it was to borrow that identity as thoroughly as trademark law permitted. What the packaging revolution accomplished ultimately was the visual erasure of the product's origin. A tub of margarine labelled Country Morning and coloured the warm yellow of fresh cream asked nothing of the consumer. It did not ask her to think about hydrogenation or deodorization, or the factory in which it had been manufactured. It asked only that she recognise the colour and the name and reach for it, as she would reach for anything familiar, anything she had reached for before, anything that looked, from 3 feet away and at a slight angle, more or less like the thing she'd grown up with. Margarine did not arrive into an empty landscape. By the time it began its real push into the American mainstream, there was already a generation of home cooks who had been trained, through Crisco advertising and corporate-produced cookbooks, to view hydrogenated vegetable shortening as a cleaner, more modern, more reliable alternative to lard. Margarine, in this sense, had a warm room waiting for it. Crisco arrived in 1911, produced by Procter & Gamble, and it was marketed with a thoroughness that set the template for every processed food campaign that followed. The company printed and distributed cookbooks by the millions. It sent product samples to home economics teachers, to hospitals, to cooking schools. It placed advertisements in women's magazines that described lard, the fat that American households had been cooking with for generations, as unclean, animal, unsuitable for the modern kitchen. Crisco was vegetable-based. Crisco was white and odourless, and came in a neat tin. Crisco, the advertising suggested, was what a hygienic and forward-thinking woman used. The lard industry had no comparable response. Lard was a byproduct of pork processing, produced and sold by meat packers who were primarily in the business of meat and did not have advertising departments equipped to fight a coordinated campaign about modernity and cleanliness. Lard lost. It lost not because it was inferior as a cooking fat. For many applications, it is in fact superior, but because it lost the argument about what it represented, and in consumer behaviour, representation frequently defeats performance. Crisco's victory over Laird in the American kitchen of the 19-teens and 20s established a precedent that the margarine industry would later follow precisely, that an industrially processed fat positioned correctly could displace a traditional one without being demonstrably better in any culinary sense. All it required was sufficient advertising, a credible cleanliness or health narrative, and a competitor that did not fight back effectively. Margarine had watched Crisco accomplish this and had taken careful notes. There was also a more direct relationship between shortening and margarine in the American kitchen of the 1940s and 50s. They occupied the same mental category. Once a housewife had accepted the premise that hydrogenated vegetable fat was appropriate for baking, that Crisco in the pie crust was not a compromise but a choice, the conceptual distance between that acceptance and the acceptance of margarine on the breakfast table was not large. The underlying chemistry was similar. The industrial origin was similar. The health claims being made about both products were similar in structure, if not always in specific content. Crisco also served a more practical function in margarine's rise. It normalised the tub. Before Crisco, cooking fats were bought in blocks, in buckets, in paper-wrapped packages. Crisco came in a round tin with a lid, a container you opened, scooped from, and kept in the cabinet. This was new. It was also, it turned out, extremely convenient, and convenience in kitchen products creates loyalty with an efficiency that flavour alone rarely achieves. When margarine arrived in similar containers, it was entering a kitchen that had already been trained by Crisco to accept that format as normal. The packaging was familiar. The product category was familiar. The only unfamiliar element was the application, breakfast instead of baking, and that too would become familiar quickly enough. The through line from Crisco to margarine is not always discussed in histories of American food, but it is one of the cleaner stories in the landscape, a consumer culture that had been systematically prepared, over 4 decades, to accept industrial fat as a domestic staple, and that was therefore ready, when the time came, to accept the next iteration of the same basic argument. One of the most quietly effective strategies that processed food companies employed in the 1950s was the cookbook, specifically the free cookbook, distributed by the company itself, filled with recipes that happened to require their product. These were not fringe publications. Some of them were printed in the millions and given away with appliances, mailed to new homeowners, or bundled with the product itself. They looked like ordinary cookbooks, hardbound or spiral-bound, illustrated with cheerful colour photographs, organised by meal and occasion. What distinguished them from ordinary cookbooks was a single structural feature. Every recipe, without exception, called for the sponsor's product. You were not reading a cookbook. You were reading an extended advertisement that had been formatted to look like a cookbook. And it worked because it looked exactly like what it wasn't. The recipes themselves were often genuinely good. The companies employed home economists, a profession that was itself a product of the same era. Women trained in domestic science who occupied a strange professional space between the kitchen and the laboratory, who developed recipes that tasted acceptable and photographed well, and were achievable by a home cook of average skill. The goal was not deception in the crude sense. The goal was habit formation. If a woman made the same brand of Margarine's recommended coffee cake 3 times, the brand name became embedded in her understanding of what coffee cake required. It was no longer margarine in the recipe. It was the margarine, and specifically the one whose name was printed at the top of the page. What disappeared from these cookbooks, quietly and without announcement, was the recipe that called for butter. Not from American cooking entirely, butter recipes continued to exist in other cookbooks, in the recipes passed down through families, in the professional kitchen. But in the corporate cookbook, butter was absent. When a fat was required, the corporate cookbook supplied the sponsor's product in its place, and the recipe was written in such a way that no substitution was implied or invited. This was not a small omission. The corporate cookbook was for many post-war American households the primary reference for everyday cooking. It came free with the refrigerator or the range. It was the right size for the kitchen drawer. It had an index. It was used. Over a decade of using a cookbook that contained no butter, a housewife was not actively choosing margarine over butter each time she cooked. She was simply following the recipe. The choice had already been made, encoded into the text, by someone in a corporate kitchen whose job was to make sure the choice always came out the same way. This is a subtler form of influence than advertising, and in some ways a more durable one. Advertisements can be ignored. Recipes are followed. The broader cultural effect was the gradual disappearance of the techniques that required butter specifically. The reductions, the beurre blanc sauces, the pan drippings enriched with a cold knob of real fat at the last moment, from the repertoire of the average American home cook. These techniques did not vanish from professional kitchens or from the cuisines of France and Italy, where the corporate cookbook had less penetration. But in the American home kitchen of the 1950s and 60s they faded, replaced not by inferior techniques but simply by different ones, techniques that worked adequately with margarine, that did not reveal its limitations, that produced results which were, on their own terms, perfectly acceptable. The recipes that made butter indispensable were slowly replaced by recipes in which butter was replaceable, and this too was not an accident. When food scientists in the 1950s began engineering lower-fat products, margarine among them, a practical question arose. If you remove the fat from food, what do you replace it with to maintain the texture, the mouthfeel, the quality that makes food taste like something a human being would voluntarily eat? The answer, in most cases, was sugar, refined carbohydrates, and various stabilizers. This trade was made largely without announcement. Fat, in the context of 1950s nutritional thinking, was the enemy. Saturated fat was dangerous, the science said, and the food industry had been presented with both a health mandate and a commercial opportunity. Make lower fat products and market them as better for you. The opportunity was taken. The trade-off involved was not prominently disclosed. Fat is not simply a source of calories in food. It is a primary vehicle for flavour and a critical component of texture. The richness of a piece of cheese, the satisfying weight of a properly made pastry, the way a good sauce coats the back of a spoon, these qualities are largely functions of fat content. When fat is reduced or replaced in a food product, the result is something that looks like the original and may even carry the same name but experiences differently in the mouth. It is thinner or drier, or it disappears too quickly, or it leaves no pleasant coating sensation. The product is, technically speaking, food. It simply does not eat like what it is pretending to be. The solution food scientists arrived at, reliably and across product categories, was to compensate with sugar and refined starches. Sugar restores palatability to low-fat products by stimulating the reward centers of the brain in ways that partially substitute for the pleasure of fat. It also contributes to texture and mouthfeel in ways that partially mask the absence of what was removed. A low-fat yogurt without added sugar is thin and sour and entirely unpleasant. A low-fat yogurt with sufficient sugar added is something that a significant portion of the American population will eat happily for decades without registering that the thing they are eating bears no meaningful resemblance to yogurt as it was originally understood. Margarine itself was not, strictly speaking, a low-fat product. It contained roughly the same fat content as butter, just different fat. But it arrived as part of a broader industrial food movement that was simultaneously reducing fat in some products and replacing saturated fat with unsaturated fat in others, and the sugar compensation pattern ran through all of it. The 1950s and 60s, which marked the beginning of the mass marketing of processed food on health grounds, also marked the beginning of a sustained increase in American sugar consumption that would continue for decades. These two trends were not unrelated. They were in many cases the same product. What was not said in any of the advertising was that the trade being made was uncertain, that removing saturated fat and replacing it with hydrogenated vegetable oil might not produce a net cardiovascular benefit, that replacing fat with sugar might introduce a different category of risk. The science on all of this was incomplete, genuinely, legitimately incomplete, not suppressed or ignored, but simply not yet done. But the products were already on the shelves. The marketing was already running. The American household had already been told, by doctors and by the American Heart Association and by the woman on television spreading margarine on her family's breakfast toast, that the substitution was beneficial. Revising that message would have required the kind of institutional humility that large organizations, whether commercial or medical, do not find easy to summon. The fat that was removed from the American diet in the post-war era did not simply disappear. It was replaced by other fats, by sugars, by a cascade of compensations that would take another 50 years to fully understand. What the 1950s housewife was told was that she was doing better. What she was actually doing was different. Whether different turned out to mean better is a question that nutritional science is, in some respects, still working through. The modern supermarket, fluorescent-lit, aisle-organised, refrigerated case after refrigerated case, was itself a relatively new institution in the 1950s, and it was designed from the beginning to encourage exactly the kind of purchasing behaviour that processed food companies depended on. The margarine tub sat in the dairy case right next to the butter, and it cost less. The shelf placement was not accidental. The supermarket as a format had existed since the 1930s, but it was the post-war era that drove its rapid expansion across suburban America. The new suburbs needed new stores large enough to serve communities that had no neighbourhood market, stores accessible by car, stores where a housewife could purchase everything she needed for a week's worth of cooking in a single trip. The supermarket was the answer to that need, and processed food manufacturers understood immediately that it was also the answer to theirs. The supermarket shelf was a commercial medium with its own grammar. Eye level was premium. End-of-aisle displays drove impulse purchases. The dairy case, lined with refrigerated glass doors, created a sense of freshness and abundance that helped everything within it seem like a better purchase than it might have seemed on a warm shelf. Margarine benefited from its placement in the dairy case specifically because the dairy case was where butter was, where it had always been, and the association of margarine with that space borrowed, at the point of purchase, some of the naturalness and legitimacy that dairy products carried automatically. Pricing was displayed prominently, and the price gap between butter and margarine was real and significant. For a household managing a grocery budget with the attention that post-war American households generally applied to it, planning menus, comparing prices, calculating cost per serving with the precision of someone who had grown up during the Depression, the cheaper product in the dairy case was not invisible. It was noted, it was considered, and it was increasingly chosen, not always for ideological reasons or health reasons, but simply because it cost less, and the health rationale made the economically motivated choice feel like the right one rather than the reluctant one. The supermarket also made processed food anonymous, in a way that the previous generation's shopping had not been. When you bought butter from a farmer or from a local creamery, you knew at some level where it had come from. When you bought margarine from a supermarket shelf, it came from a tub with a pastoral name and a price sticker, and its origin, the soybean fields, the hydrogenation plant, the deodorization tanks, was as invisible as if it did not exist. The supermarket was not trying to hide anything. It simply had no mechanism for displaying the journey, and the journey was not the kind that the manufacturers were eager to illuminate. What the supermarket made possible, above all, was comparison at the moment of purchase, and in the 1950s, with health claims on the packaging and a price advantage at the register, margarine won that comparison consistently enough to become a staple in a very short period of time. The store was not neutral. It was a designed environment, and it had been designed in ways that were both intentional and structural to favour the product that was cheaper to produce, more profitable to stock, and backed by advertising budgets that the dairy farmer standing behind his butter did not have and could not match. In 1950s food advertising, the doctor was a recurring figure, appearing in print ads, mentioned approvingly in television commercials, cited in packaging copy. He was usually depicted in a white coat, occasionally holding a chart, always nodding reassuringly in the direction of whatever product was being sold. The implicit message was medical endorsement, even when the actual evidence for the health claim was, at best, preliminary. The doctor in the advertisement was not a specific doctor. He was a type, calm, authoritative, male, middle-aged. The visual shorthand for institutional medical knowledge applied to the domestic purchasing decision. He appeared behind butter substitutes and breakfast cereals and cigarettes with equal composure. He was not troubled by inconsistency. He was a device. The use of medical authority in advertising was not illegal, and in many cases it was not even inaccurate in a strict sense. The HA had made recommendations about saturated fat. Some physicians had advised patients to reduce their butter consumption. Research existed, contested, incomplete, but extant, suggesting a connection between dietary fat and cardiovascular disease. The advertisements did not invent the medical consensus. They borrowed it, amplified it, and applied it with a specificity that the original recommendations had not intended. What the doctor in the advertisement accomplished was the transfer of clinical authority to a commercial transaction. When a physician tells you to change your diet, the recommendation carries the weight of professional obligation. The doctor is, in theory, telling you what is best for you based on the best available evidence, with your well-being as the primary consideration. When an advertisement invokes the same language and the same visual register, it borrows that weight without the obligation. The advertisement has a different primary consideration, but the white coat looks the same. The 1950s housewife was not, in the main, naive. She was capable of understanding that advertisements were trying to sell her things, but the food advertising of this era operated in a register that was meaningfully different from the advertising for lipstick or automobiles, products that were openly aspirational, openly commercial, making no claim to be anything other than what they were. Food advertising that cited medical research and invoked the authority of physicians was asking to be received as information rather than persuasion. It was presenting the purchase decision as a health decision with a correct answer, and the correct answer happened to be the thing being advertised. This put the consumer in an awkward position. Skepticism about a lipstick advertisement is costless. Skepticism about a medical claim carries the implied risk that if you dismiss it, and the claim turns out to be true, the cost is your health. The asymmetry favoured the advertiser. It was easier, psychologically safer, to accept the claim and buy the margarine than to question the research and continue buying butter and spend the next 20 years wondering whether you were giving your family heart disease at breakfast. The doctor in the advertisement understood this asymmetry, even if he was only a drawing of a doctor in a white coat pointing at a tub of margarine with an expression of measured professional approval. For most of its early life, margarine had been sold primarily as a cheaper alternative to butter. But in the 1950s and 60s, as the nutritional debate around saturated fat intensified, margarine companies made a significant strategic pivot. They stopped apologizing for not being butter and started arguing that they were superior to it. This was a remarkable shift in tone, and it worked. The pivot was made possible by the convergence of several things happening simultaneously: the AHA recommendations, the growing public awareness of Ancel Keys' research, the general cultural trust in scientific authority, and the specific receptiveness of post-war American consumers to the idea that traditional practices could be improved upon by modern knowledge. Butter was traditional, margarine was modern, and modern in this framing did not simply mean newer, it meant informed, evidence-based, better for you and your family in ways that the unexamined tradition of butter consumption had never been. The language changed first. Advertisements that had previously described margarine as economical or convenient began to describe it as heart-smart and doctor-recommended. The price advantage was still present and still mentioned, but it was no longer the primary argument. The primary argument was now health, a word that carries an emotional weight that economy never quite achieves. Saving money is practical. Protecting your family's health is moral. The transition from the first argument to the second was a transition from appealing to the consumer's financial judgment to appealing to her identity as a caregiver, and it was considerably more powerful. premium margarine products began to appear, formulations that were more expensive than standard margarine, positioned not against butter on price but against butter on health. These products cost nearly as much as butter. They were bought not by households trying to economize, but by households trying to make the right choice. The consumer who had been told she was sacrificing quality for cost in choosing margarine was now told she was paying a premium for a superior product, and she believed it, because the medical authority behind the claim was real, partial, contested, more complex than the packaging suggested, but real. The better for you pivot also had the effect of making the conversation about margarine entirely about what it was not, specifically that it was not butter, and that the things butter was made of were the things you were supposed to be avoiding. Margarine won by not being something. It won by the absence of saturated fat, by the absence of cholesterol, by the absence of the things that the medical establishment had identified as problematic. It did not need to win on flavour or texture or culinary performance, because the terms of the competition had been changed to ones on which it could succeed. You do not need to taste better than butter. You need to be better for you than butter. Whether that claim was accurate is a question that would take decades to answer. In the 1950s and 60s, the question was largely unasked because the answer seemed to have already been provided, in a white coat by someone with a chart. Processed food companies understood something in the 1950s that their critics were slower to recognise. The most durable brand loyalties are formed in childhood. A child who grew up eating margarine, who learned to associate its particular taste and texture with breakfast, with toast, with the smell of her mother's kitchen, would, as an adult, be unlikely to experience it as a substitute for something better. It would simply be the thing that toast tasted like. This is not a cynical observation about the food industry, or not only that. It is a basic fact about how human beings form food preferences. The flavours we encounter repeatedly in early childhood become the baseline against which all subsequent flavours are measured. Not the best, necessarily, just the reference point, the thing that tastes like home. Food companies in the 1950s were not unaware of this. The marketing literature of the era, the internal documents that have since been examined by food historians and journalists, shows a consistent interest in the household as a system, in understanding how purchasing decisions were made, who made them, and how early preferences were formed. Children were not the primary target of food advertising in this period in the way they would later become. The direct-to-child marketing era was still decades away. But children were present in the household that was being targeted, and the habits formed there were understood to be investments. The practical mechanism was simple. Mothers bought margarine, mothers cooked with margarine, children ate what was cooked. There was no advertising required to reach the child. The child was reached through the kitchen, through the food that appeared on the table without comment or explanation, through the taste that became normal through repetition. By the time these children were adults, by the time they were standing in a supermarket in 1970 making their own purchasing decisions, the question of butter versus margarine was not experienced as a meaningful choice between two equivalent options. It was experienced as a choice between the familiar and the unfamiliar, and the familiar was margarine. This dynamic also worked in reverse to insulate the product against criticism. When the research on trans fats began to accumulate in the 1980s and 90s, one of the factors that slowed its public impact was that an enormous number of Americans had been eating margarine for 30 years. The product was not a novelty they could easily be warned away from. It was breakfast. It was childhood. It was the smell of toast in a kitchen they had grown up in. The emotional weight of that association did not neutralize the research, but it complicated the message. You were not just being told that a product was harmful. You were being told that something from your childhood was harmful, which is a different kind of news, and one that tends to be received with more resistance. The long game worked. The children of the 1950s margarine kitchen became the parents of the 1970s and 80s, and many of them bought margarine for their own children, without revisiting the decision that had been made, on their behalf, decades earlier. The brand loyalty was real. It had been earned not through advertising directed at the child, but through the simple, powerful mechanism of feeding a child the same thing every morning until the thing and the morning became inseparable. It would be unfair to suggest that the dairy industry simply stood by while margarine reshaped the American kitchen. They lobbied, they litigated, and they advertised. But they were fighting a structural battle they were ill-equipped to win. Butter was what it was. It couldn't be made cheaper without ceasing to be butter. It couldn't be branded as modern without a certain amount of cognitive dissonance. And it could not, no matter how hard anyone tried, be placed in a tub. The dairy industry's response to the margarine threat was, in the most charitable reading, the response of an institution that had spent a century not needing a strategy and was now required to develop one in real time, under pressure, against a competitor that had been thinking strategically since the beginning. The National Dairy Council, founded in 1915, was primarily an educational organisation. Its original mandate was to increase milk consumption through nutrition information distributed to schools and households. It was not built for combat. When combat arrived, it adapted slowly and imperfectly. The legislative strategy, the pink margarine laws, the dye restrictions, the heavy taxation, had worked for decades as a delaying action. But it was a fundamentally defensive posture, and defensive postures in consumer markets tend to be losing ones. Every law that restricted margarine kept it off some shelves and out of some kitchens. It did not make butter more appealing. It did not address the health narrative that was building around saturated fat. It didn't counter the advertising that was reaching millions of households through their television sets. It irritated consumers who wanted to buy margarine and couldn't, and irritated consumers are not easily converted into loyal customers of the product that caused the irritation. By the 1960s, the dairy industry had begun investing in its own advertising campaigns. The real campaigns, emphasizing that butter was natural, that it came from a simple and honest process, that it had been a part of human diets for thousands of years, arrived roughly a decade after the margarine industry had already established its health narrative in the public mind. The arguments were not wrong. Butter is natural. The process is simple. The history is long. But naturalness had been successfully framed, by this point, as a neutral quality at best and a liability at worst. The margarine advertisements had spent 10 years telling American consumers that the way things had always been done was the thing that was giving their husbands heart attacks. A campaign celebrating tradition was not the most effective counter to that particular argument. The dairy industry also faced a problem that it could not advertise its way out of: the medical community. Physicians were advising patients to reduce saturated fat. Hospital dietitians were recommending margarine. The AHA was publishing dietary guidelines that pointed away from butter. The dairy industry could run advertisements, but it could not easily contradict a doctor, and in the 1960s, contradicting a doctor was not a communication strategy that tested well with the American public. The authority gap was real and wide, and closing it required the kind of long-term investment in nutritional research and medical relationships that the industry had not made in time to matter. What the dairy farmers were doing, for the most part, was farming. They were producing milk and cream and butter with the same methods that had produced good results for generations, and they were watching, from a distance, as the cultural and commercial landscape shifted beneath them in ways that their organizations were struggling to address. The product was fine. The product was, by most culinary measures, excellent. The product was losing anyway, to an inferior competitor with a better story, better distribution, a lower price, and a medical establishment that had, for reasons that would eventually be partly revised, taken its side. One of margarine's most persuasive selling points, that it was significantly cheaper than butter, was, in the short term, simply true. For households running on tight post-war budgets, the price difference was not trivial. But the true cost of the transition to processed fats was not priced into the margarine tub. It appeared decades later in the form of a rather large body of research into trans fats. The price advantage of margarine was real and structural, not accidental. Vegetable oils, the raw material for margarine, were cheap because the crops that produced them were grown in enormous quantities, supported by agricultural policy and processed by an industrial infrastructure that achieved economies of scale unavailable to butter production. Butter required cows. Cows required land, feed, veterinary care, and time. Soybeans required none of these things in the same proportion, and the gap between the cost of producing a pound of butter and the cost of producing a pound of margarine was therefore not a temporary market condition, but a durable structural feature of the American agricultural economy. This cost advantage was compounded by shelf life. Butter, being a natural dairy product, spoiled. It required refrigeration, careful handling, and relatively rapid consumption. Margarine, hydrogenated and preserved, lasted considerably longer under the same conditions. For a retailer, longer shelf life meant lower spoilage losses and more predictable inventory management. For a household managing a weekly grocery budget, it meant less waste. These were genuine practical advantages that translated directly into economic value, and the economic value was real for the households that benefited from it. A family eating breakfast 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year, saved a measurable amount of money by choosing margarine, and that money went somewhere else in the budget where it was also needed. What was not calculated into the price could not have been calculated given the state of nutritional science at the time, was the health cost of the trans fatty acids produced during hydrogenation. Research that accumulated slowly through the 1980s and reached public attention in the 1990s suggested that trans fats raised LDL cholesterol and lowered HDL cholesterol, a combination associated with increased cardiovascular risk. The irony was precise and uncomfortable. Margarine had been sold partly on the grounds that it was better for the heart than butter, and the evidence eventually suggested that it was, in fact, worse. Not marginally worse, but significantly worse, specifically because of the hydrogenation process that gave it its solid, spreadable form. The households that had saved money on margarine for 3 decades had not saved money, if the full accounting included healthcare costs associated with the dietary change. This is not a calculation that can be made cleanly. Too many variables, too many confounding factors, too much individual variation in how bodies process dietary fat. But the directional conclusion is not seriously disputed. The cheap option turned out to carry costs that were not visible at the point of purchase and would not become visible for a generation. The price on the shelf was real. The savings were real. The choice to prefer margarine on economic grounds was rational given the information available. What was not real was the implicit promise embedded in the price advantage, the suggestion that cheaper also meant better, that the market had delivered a product that was simultaneously less expensive and more healthful than what it replaced. Markets do not, as a general rule, deliver that outcome. When a product is significantly cheaper than a natural alternative, the most likely explanation is that something has been removed or replaced, and the question worth asking is what? In the case of margarine, the answer was the fat had been chemically altered, and the alteration had consequences that would take 50 years to fully price. Hydrogenated vegetable oil, the primary ingredient in most margarines sold throughout the 1950s, 60s and 70s, produces, as a byproduct of the hydrogenation process, a form of unsaturated fat called a trans fat. By the 1990s, researchers had accumulated enough evidence to suggest that trans fats were associated with increased cardiovascular risk, more so, in fact, than the saturated fats in butter that margarine had been designed to replace. The story of how trans fats went from undisclosed industrial byproduct to regulated dietary hazard is a story about the speed of science relative to the speed of commerce, and about what happens when those two speeds are mismatched for several decades. The hydrogenation process had been known since the early 20th century. The existence of trans fatty acids as a byproduct of that process had been known in chemical terms for nearly as long. What was not known, what took decades of epidemiological research to establish, was what trans fats did inside the human body over the course of a lifetime of daily consumption. The early warning signs appeared in the 1960s and 70s in research that was initially received with the same polite skepticism that had greeted the critics of Amcal Keys. A Dutch researcher named Martien Catan began publishing work in the 1980s suggesting that trans fatty acids had adverse effects on blood lipid profiles, specifically that they raised LDL cholesterol while simultaneously lowering HDL cholesterol, a double effect that made them, from a cardiovascular standpoint, worse than the saturated fats they had replaced. The research was careful, methodologically sound, and deeply unwelcome to an industry that had spent 30 years selling its product as the heart-healthy alternative. The response from the margarine industry was, initially, vigorous denial, not of the research findings specifically, but of their relevance. Industry-funded studies appeared. The complexity of dietary fat metabolism was emphasized. The difficulty of isolating single dietary variables in large population studies was correctly noted. These were not entirely bad faith arguments. Nutritional science is genuinely complicated, and the relationship between any single dietary component and long-term health outcomes is genuinely difficult to establish with certainty. But the arguments were deployed not in the service of scientific caution, but in the service of market protection, and that purpose was visible enough to undermine their credibility over time. By the mid-1990s, the scientific consensus had shifted sufficiently that the FDA began requiring trans fat disclosure on nutrition labels, a process that was completed in 2006, when trans fats were required to be listed separately on all packaged food labels. The effect was immediate and significant. Consumers who had been told for decades that margarine was better for them than butter could now read, on the label of the margarine tub, a quantity of trans fats that was, in many cases, higher than zero and sometimes considerably higher. Sales shifted. Manufacturers reformulated. The industry that had built its health narrative on the back of saturated fat research now scrambled to remove the ingredient that its own product had introduced into the American diet in quantity. The reformulation was real, and the trans fat content of most margarines sold today is negligible or absent. But the episode left a residue that has not entirely settled. The product that had been sold as the medically endorsed, scientifically superior alternative to a natural fat had turned out to require significant chemical revision before that claim could be sustained. The revision was made, the claim continues, in modified form. What continues alongside it, for those who remember the history, is the knowledge that the claim had been made with considerable confidence before the evidence was complete, and that the confidence had served the manufacturer more reliably than it had served the consumer. One of the most underappreciated effects of the 1950s processed food revolution was its gradual redefinition of what food was supposed to taste like. A generation raised on margarine, on canned vegetables, on instant coffee and powdered milk did not experience these things as substitutes. They experienced them as the baseline. Real butter, tasted after a childhood of margarine, could seem almost too rich, too sharp, too much. This is not a metaphor. It is a documented sensory phenomenon. Human taste preferences are calibrated by exposure. We learn to expect the flavors we encounter repeatedly, and we evaluate new flavors against those expectations. A child whose palate is formed by margarine does not have a suppressed preference for butter waiting to be unlocked. She has a genuine preference for margarine, because margarine is what her experience has told her food tastes like. The processed food industry of the 1950s and 60s was not, in the main, thinking about this in the long term. Companies were trying to sell products, and the most efficient way to sell products was to make them palatable. Palatability was achieved through the application of salt, sugar, fat, often in combinations calibrated by food scientists who were very good at identifying the precise quantities that produced maximum consumption. The result was products that were intensely flavored in specific narrow ways, very salty or very sweet, or coated in a fat-based richness that was broader and more aggressive than the subtler flavors of unprocessed food. Real food, the kind that is not engineered for maximum palatability, tastes different. Fresh vegetables have bitterness and earthiness and variation. Real butter has a complexity of flavor that varies with the season and the diet of the cow. A piece of properly ripened fruit has acidity and sweetness in proportions that shift from bite to bite. These qualities are pleasurable to a palate accustomed to them. They can seem unfamiliar, even difficult to a palate calibrated by processed food, which has been engineered to remove variation in favor of consistent, predictable stimulation. The consequence was that real food began to require an acquired taste, a phrase that, if you think about it carefully, describes something that used to be the default. A child who grew up in 1920 eating what her family grew and cooked did not need to acquire a taste for fresh vegetables. They were simply what food tasted like. A child who grew up in 1960 eating canned peas and margarine and packaged bread might, when presented with a fresh pea or a piece of good butter, find the experience not transcendent but strange. The reference point had moved. This shift is not undone easily or quickly. It is not undone by a single good meal or a persuasive article about the virtues of traditional food. It requires sustained re-exposure, the slow, deliberate recalibration of a palate that was formed under specific conditions and has been maintained under those conditions for years. Some people make that journey. Many do not because they lack the capacity, but because the food environment they inhabit continues to provide, at every meal and every snack, the same processed signals that calibrated their palate in the first place. The taste of normal, once set, tends to remain set. The margarine generation did not merely switch fats. It moved the center of the flavor map, and the movement turned out to be one of the more durable things the 1950s kitchen produced. The advertising agencies that handled processed food accounts in the 1950s were not, by and large, lying in the legal sense. They were doing something more sophisticated. They were selecting which truths to amplify, which uncertainties to omit, and which associations, health, modernity, scientific authority to plant in the consumer's mind through repetition until they felt like common sense. This is a description of advertising generally, but it applied with particular force to food advertising in this era because the stakes were higher than usual. Food advertising that invoked medical research was not selling a lifestyle or an aspiration. It was selling a health decision, and health decisions carry a moral weight that most consumer choices do not. The advertising agencies understood this, and they used it with considerable skill. The craft of the 1950s food advertisement was in its architecture, the careful arrangement of elements that each carried independent credibility, and that, combined, produced a conclusion the advertisement itself never had to state outright. A white-coated figure, a citation of research, a reputable organization's name, A warm domestic scene. A price that was lower than the alternative. No single element of this architecture was dishonest. The research existed. The organisation had made recommendations. The price was accurate. The domestic scene was aspirational, but not fraudulent. What was constructed from these elements? The conclusion that you were making the medically correct, scientifically endorsed, financially responsible, family protective choice by buying margarine was never written in any advertisement in so many words. It was assembled by the consumer, from the pieces provided, and the assembly happened so reliably across so many households that it might as well have been printed on the package. The omissions were as important as the inclusions. The contested nature of the saturated fat research was not mentioned. The existence of scientists who disagreed with Uncle Keyes was not acknowledged. The trans fat content of hydrogenated oils was not disclosed, partly because disclosure was not required, and partly because the research was still developing, and partly because it was not the kind of information that helped sell the product. The industrial origin of the ingredients, the solvent extraction, the hydrogenation, the deodorization, was not depicted. These were not lies, they were silences, and silences in advertising are a form of argument. What is not said shapes the impression as surely as what is said, often more durably, because it cannot be checked against a fact. The 1950s advertising industry was also operating in an environment of unusually high consumer trust. Advertising was a relatively young medium in its modern form, and its capacity for sophisticated psychological manipulation had not yet been widely examined or debunked in popular culture. The consumer skepticism that would develop through the 1960s and 70s, fed by the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, and an emerging critical literature about corporate behaviour, was not yet present in anything like its later form. The housewife watching a margarine commercial in 1954 was not applying the same analytical distance that her daughter would apply to the same commercial in 1974. She was receiving it more or less as it was intended to be received, as information delivered by a credible source about a product that would benefit her family. What the advertising industry sold ultimately was not margarine. It sold the feeling of making the right choice. Margarine was just the vehicle through which that feeling was delivered, and the delivery was so effective for so long that the feeling outlasted the evidence that had originally been used to justify it. The United States government's relationship with the processed food industry in the 1950s was, to put it gently, cozy. Agricultural subsidies shaped which crops were grown in abundance, which in turn shaped what food manufacturers had cheapest access to, which in turn shaped what ended up in American kitchens. The vegetable oils used in margarine were not expensive, in part because the crops they came from were not expensive, and those crops were not expensive in part because of policy decisions made in Washington. This is not a conspiracy. It is the ordinary operation of agricultural policy in a democratic country, where farming states have significant political representation, and where the government has a long-standing interest in maintaining food price stability and agricultural employment. The consequences of that policy for the contents of the American pantry were real and durable, but they were not the primary purpose of the policy. They were the secondary effect, the spillover from decisions made for other reasons that happened to benefit certain industries more than others. The government's role in the dietary fat debate was more direct in one specific area, the military. Federal nutritional guidelines, developed partly to inform military feeding programs, carried significant civilian influence because they were taken seriously by the medical establishment and cited by the same physicians who advised their patients on diet. When government-affiliated nutritional bodies made recommendations about fat consumption, those recommendations did not stay within the military supply chain. They travelled through the medical community and through the press into civilian kitchens. The regulatory environment around food labelling was also, in the 1950s, considerably less demanding than it would later become. Disclosure requirements were limited. Health claims were not regulated with the specificity that would be applied by the FDA in later decades. A food company could describe its product as heart-healthy or doctor-recommended without the evidentiary requirements that those claims would eventually require. This regulatory looseness was not unique to the margarine industry. It characterized the food advertising environment broadly, but it benefited margarine specifically because the health claims were central to its repositioning in the market. The government's most consequential contribution to the margarine story was arguably its role in shaping the agricultural economy that made processed food cheap. The corn and soybean subsidies that developed through the mid-20th century produced an abundant, low-cost supply of the vegetable oils that margarine manufacturers needed. Without those subsidies, the price advantage of margarine over butter would have been narrower, and the economic argument for switching would have been correspondingly weaker. Policy did not cause Americans to choose margarine, but policy created the economic conditions in which choosing margarine was rational, and it maintained those conditions consistently enough that the choice, once made, was reinforced every time a consumer compared prices at the grocery store. The government did not intend to reshape the American breakfast table. It intended to stabilize agricultural markets, support farm incomes, and ensure food security. That the secondary effect of those intentions was a kitchen full of processed fats and a generation raised on margarine was not the plan. It was the outcome, and the distinction between plan and outcome is not much comfort to the cow. In the 1950s, the women's magazine occupied a unique position in American domestic life. It was simultaneously aspirational and instructional, a publication that told you who you should be and then sold you the products that would get you there. Food advertising in these magazines was not presented as advertising. It was presented as guidance, as recipes, as the accumulated domestic wisdom of women who had already figured it out. The boundary between editorial content and paid promotion in the women's magazines of this era was, by modern standards, remarkably permeable. Advertisers did not merely buy the pages around the articles, they influenced the articles, providing recipes that featured their products, supplying home economists whose advice happened to align with their commercial interests, funding the test kitchens whose findings appeared in the magazine's own pages as independent guidance. The reader who trusted Good Housekeeping or Ladies' Home Journal or Better Homes and Gardens was trusting a publication that had financial relationships with the companies whose products it was, in various ways, recommending. This was not a secret. The magazine business model of the era was understood broadly to involve advertiser support, but understanding the business model in the abstract is different from maintaining appropriate skepticism while reading a recipe in a trusted publication. The recipes did not come with asterisks. The home economics columns did not disclose funding sources. The cheerful, competent woman in the magazine photographs was not identified as a paid model representing a corporate client. She was simply there, in her clean kitchen, spreading margarine on her family's toast with the quiet confidence of someone who had made the right choice and was inviting you to make it too. The women's magazine also served a social function that amplified its commercial influence. In the post-war suburban landscape, where women who had grown up in different cities and different family cultures found themselves living in new communities without the extended family networks that had previously provided domestic guidance. The magazine was, for many households, the closest available substitute for an experienced older woman's advice. It told you what to cook, how to cook it, how to present it, and what to buy in order to do all of those things correctly. The authority it carried was the authority of collective domestic expertise, and it was an authority that many women genuinely needed and genuinely trusted. Margarine appeared in this context not as an advertisement, but as an ingredient, listed in recipes, recommended in nutritional columns, demonstrated in step-by-step cooking features. The housewife who followed a good housekeeping recipe that called for margarine was not, in her own experience, responding to a commercial message. She was following instructions from a trusted source. The commercial message had already been delivered invisibly at the level of editorial decision-making long before the recipe reached her hands. The women's magazine did not sell margarine to American housewives. It made margarine the thing that the trusted, authoritative voice of domestic expertise happened to use, and that turned out to be a more effective form of selling than anything the advertising department could have managed on its own. For all of the scientific confidence with which saturated fat was condemned in the 1950s, the actual epidemiological picture was considerably messier. Populations that consumed large amounts of butter and other animal fats in Scandinavia or in France did not always exhibit the rates of cardiovascular disease that the saturated fat hypothesis would have predicted. These inconvenient data points were not widely advertised by the people selling margarine. The French paradox, as it would eventually come to be called, was perhaps the most famous of these anomalies. The French, who consumed butter, cream, cheese, and animal fat with an enthusiasm that would have made an American cardiologist of the 1960s genuinely anxious, had lower rates of cardiovascular disease than Americans who were consuming considerably less saturated fat and considerably more margarine. This observation was not unknown. It appeared in the medical literature. It was discussed at conferences. It did not reach the breakfast table. The reasons it did not reach the breakfast table are worth understanding. Epidemiological anomalies, findings that complicate a dominant hypothesis, do not travel as easily as findings that confirm one. A research paper demonstrating that the French eat a great deal of butter and don't die of heart disease at the predicted rate is, from a publishing standpoint, a less complete story than a research paper demonstrating a clean correlation between fat intake and cardiovascular mortality. It raises questions without answering them. It requires caveats about confounding variables, the wine, the portion sizes, the social structure of French meals, the genetic variation between populations. These caveats make it difficult to communicate to a public that has been trained to expect simple answers to dietary questions. There was also a structural asymmetry in who was motivated to communicate what. The margarine industry had strong commercial incentives to amplify research that supported the saturated fat hypothesis and weak incentives to amplify research that complicated it. The dairy industry had the opposite incentives but, as we have established, a weaker communications infrastructure. The result was a public information environment in which the dominant message, saturated fat is dangerous, replace it with vegetable-based alternatives, was consistently and loudly transmitted, and the complications were consistently and quietly set aside. What real butter was actually doing to the people who ate it throughout the post-war decades is a question that nutritional science has continued to work through with diminishing certainty about the original answers. The current research landscape on saturated fat and cardiovascular disease is considerably more nuanced than the landscape of 1955, more attentive to the type of saturated fat, the overall dietary context, the difference between replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat versus replacing it with refined carbohydrates. Butter has not been fully rehabilitated by this research, but it has been substantially re-evaluated, and the confidence with which it was condemned in the post-war era has not survived contact with the full body of subsequent evidence intact. The margarine it was replaced with, meanwhile, required reformulation to remove the trans fats that turned out to be the more serious problem. The story of what butter was doing to people is still being written. The early chapters were more confident than the evidence warranted. Walk down the spreads aisle of any American supermarket today, and you will find margarine still present, still in tubs, still in the dairy case, still positioned near the butter it was designed to replace. But the language on the packaging has shifted considerably. The word hydrogenated has largely disappeared. Trans fats are now regulated and disclosed, and the health claims have grown notably more careful. The margarine of today is not the margarine of 1955. It has been reformulated, sometimes several times, in response to the research that accumulated over the decades and the regulatory requirements that followed. Most products now use non-hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated oils processed in ways that minimize trans fat formation. Some use intraesterified fats, a newer form of fat modification whose long-term health effects are not yet fully established. The reformulation is real, and the trans fat reduction is genuine, and these are, by most measures, improvements. What has not changed is the structure of the product, a processed fat made from vegetable oil, modified to be solid at room temperature, coloured and flavoured to approximate butter, and sold on the basis of being better for you than the natural alternative. The health claims have grown more careful because the regulatory environment now requires more care. The FDA's trans fat labelling requirement, implemented in 2006, forced manufacturers to disclose what was in their products in a way that changed consumer behaviour measurably. The voluntary and then mandatory reformulations that followed reduced the trans fat content of most margarines to levels at or near zero. The heart-healthy claim, which had been applied with such confidence in the 1950s, now requires specific evidentiary support before it can appear on packaging. The American Heart Association, whose recommendations had been so useful to margarine manufacturers in the post-war era, has updated its guidelines multiple times in ways that reflect the more complicated picture that subsequent research produced. Butter, meanwhile, has undergone a quiet rehabilitation in the public imagination. The food culture that emerged from the early 2000s, more interested in traditional foods, in the provenance of ingredients, in the culinary properties of natural fats, was, among other things, a reassessment of the processed food consensus of the post-war decades. Butter appeared in upscale restaurant cooking, in food writing, in the advice of chefs who had always known that it browned and enriched again, in ways that its substitute could not approximate. The butter aisle grew. Artisanal butters appeared. Grass-fed butter became a category. The rehabilitation was not a scientific vindication. The nutritional debate is more complex than a simple reversal, but it was a cultural one, and it happened fast enough that the generations who had grown up being told butter was dangerous were alive to witness it. What the grocery aisle reflects today is not a resolution but a negotiation, an ongoing, imperfect, commercially driven recalibration of a product category that was reshaped by science, advertising, war, agricultural policy, and institutional authority over the course of a century. Both products are still there. Both are still making claims. The consumer standing between them is better informed than her grandmother was, equipped with labelling requirements and internet access, and a food culture that has at least partially recovered its skepticism about processed alternatives to traditional foods. Whether she's making the right choice depends on which version of the nutritional science she finds most convincing, and that, as it turns out, remains genuinely open to interpretation. The story of margarine and the 1950s. American Kitchen is not ultimately a story about one product. It is a story about how the relationship between food, science, advertising and trust was fundamentally renegotiated in a single generation, and how the average American consumer, presented with confident authority from corporations, doctors and government agencies, reasonably concluded that the people selling her something new probably knew what they were talking about. She was not wrong to trust. Trust in institutional expertise is not irrational. It is in fact the only practical option for a person who cannot personally replicate the clinical trials behind every dietary recommendation. The housewife who chose margarine in 1955 was making a reasonable decision with the information available to her. The information was incomplete. That was not her fault. What the story asks of us, sitting in our own kitchens, in our own era, with our own confident nutritional authorities telling us what to eat and what to avoid, is a specific kind of attention, not cynicism, not the wholesale rejection of expertise, which leads to worse outcomes than trusting imperfect expertise, but the attention that asks quietly, what is the financial interest behind this recommendation? How complete is the evidence? What are the critics saying? And why are they not receiving equal coverage? Has this product been on the market long enough for the long-term effects to be known? Is the certainty with which this claim is being made proportional to the certainty of the underlying research? These are not comfortable questions. They require more cognitive effort than simply accepting the recommendation. They do not always produce clear answers, and they were not questions that the 1950s kitchen was structured to encourage, because the 1950s kitchen was structured around deference to doctors, to advertisers, to the gleaming authority of science as it was understood by corporations whose primary interest was selling something. The women who spread margarine on their family's toast in 1955 were not foolish. They were doing their best with what they were given, in a world that had not yet developed the language or the habits of the kind of consumer skepticism that the era itself was in the process of making necessary. They cooked dinner every night. They read the labels they were given. They followed the recipes in the magazines and the advice of the doctors on television. They were told they were doing the right thing, and for the most part they believed it, because most of them wanted to do the right thing, and the right thing appeared to have been clearly identified. The margarine in the tub sat on the breakfast table in 1955, and it tasted like the future. It tasted like progress and science and the reasonable confidence of a country that had won a war and was going to win dinner too. That it turned out to be more complicated than that is not a surprise. It is simply history, which has always been more complicated than the advertisement suggested. Tonight, whatever you spread on your toast, at least you know the story behind it. That knowledge, unlike most things in the 1950s kitchen, is actually free. She was not a chef, and she was not a scientist, but she occupied a peculiar professional space between the two, and in the 1950s she was everywhere. The home economist was a woman, almost always a woman, with a college degree in domestic science, employed by a food company, an appliance manufacturer, a women's magazine, or a government agency to translate the products of industrial food production into something a household could use. She developed the recipes. She staffed the test kitchens. She appeared at state fairs and department store demonstrations, smiling in a clean apron, spreading margarine on a piece of bread with the confidence of someone who had done it 10,000 times, which she had. She was the human face of processed food, and she was very good at her job, which makes her story more complicated than a simple villain narrative would allow. The home economist genuinely believed, in most cases, that she was helping. Her training had taught her that the application of scientific principles to domestic life was a form of progress, that the women who came before her had cooked by instinct and tradition, and that instinct and tradition could be improved upon by measurement, standardization, and the incorporation of new products whose properties had been studied in laboratories. This was not an unreasonable position in 1950. The laboratory had produced penicillin. It had produced the technologies that won the war. The idea that it could produce a better breakfast spread was entirely consistent with the prevailing faith in science as the engine of human improvement. What the home economist brought to the margarine story specifically was credibility at the point of use. An advertisement could tell you that margarine was healthier than butter. A home economist could show you how to cook with it, explain why the substitution worked, and answer the questions that arose when you tried it yourself and found that your pie crust behaved differently, or your sautéed vegetables tasted less rich than you remembered. She was the troubleshooter for the transition, the person who smoothed the practical difficulties of replacing a natural fat with an industrial one, in recipes that had been written with the natural fat in mind. She adjusted the recipes, she recalibrated the techniques, she made the substitution work well enough that most home cooks stopped noticing that something had changed. She was also, and this is the part that requires holding two things at once, often genuinely skilled and genuinely caring about the women she was helping. The home economics profession was one of the few career paths available to educated women in the early 20th century that offered intellectual challenge and professional respect. The women who entered it were not in the main cynical corporate operatives. They were professionals who had been trained in a particular framework and were applying that framework as capably as they could within a commercial context that shaped their choices before they made them. The home economist disappeared as a professional category sometime in the 1980s, when the term acquired an old-fashioned ring and the discipline was absorbed into other fields, but her influence lasted considerably longer than her title. The recipes she developed, the techniques she standardized, the habit of reaching for the margarine tub rather than the butter dish, these things persisted in kitchens long after the woman who had introduced them had moved on. She'd done her job well enough that the job no longer needed to be done. The substitution had become normal. And normal, as we have established, is the most durable thing a processed food company can achieve. There was a time, not so very long ago in the span of American history, when a significant proportion of rural and semi-rural households kept a cow, not as a pet, not as a curiosity, but as a practical domestic animal, a producer of milk that could be separated into cream and skimmed milk. The cream churned into butter that was stored in a cool cellar and used throughout the week. This was not a romantic arrangement. The cow required daily milking, reliable feed, adequate shelter, and the kind of attentive management that added a steady obligation to the already substantial workload of a farm household. But it produced something in return that no amount of advertising could replicate. Butter made from milk you had watched produced, churned by hands you knew, tasting of the particular grass and clover of a particular pasture in a particular season. It tasted, in other words, like a place and a time, which is what all food made from local ingredients tastes like, and which is a quality that industrial production has never found a way to manufacture. The family cow did not survive the post-war period in any meaningful numbers. The urbanization and suburbanization of American life removed the physical space that a cow required. The industrialization of dairy production made the economics of a household cow absurd. Why maintain an animal when a gallon of commercially produced milk cost less than the feed required to produce it? The regulatory environment increasingly required pasteurization of milk, which a household operation could not easily provide. By the 1950s, the family cow was an anachronism, present still in rural areas, remembered by older Americans who'd grown up with one, but absent from the daily experience of most of the households that Margarine was competing for. This absence mattered for the Margarine story in a specific way. The family cow had given its household a direct, unmediated relationship with the origin of butter. You knew what went into it because you had watched what went into it. Grass, grain, water, time, the labour of milking, the satisfying resistance of the churn. This knowledge did not require a label or a disclosure requirement. It was visible. The substitution of margarine for that butter required the household to accept, in place of that visible origin, a label on a tub, and the label described ingredients whose origin and processing were entirely invisible. A household that had kept a cow was also a household that knew what butter tasted like at its best, made from the cream of a well-fed animal in good season, fresh from the churn with the complexity of flavour that commercial butter rarely achieves and that margarine does not approach. That knowledge of quality created a standard against which substitutes could be evaluated and found wanting. The household that had never known that standard had nothing to compare the margarine against, except the commercial butter it had been purchased alongside, which was itself already several steps removed from the farm. The loss of the family cow was, among other things, the loss of a reference point. It removed from daily domestic life the direct experience of where food came from and what it was capable of tasting like when made without industrial intermediaries. That loss made the margarine transition easier than it would otherwise have been, not because people chose not to know, but because the knowing was no longer built into the structure of daily life. The tub arrived in the dairy case, already coloured, already flavoured, already claiming whatever the label said it was, and there was no longer a cow in the backyard to contradict it. She does not have a single name, because she is not a single person. She's a composite, built from the documented reversals of researchers, the revised guidelines of professional organisations, and the quiet, professionally uncomfortable process by which experts who had spent careers building a framework discovered that the framework required substantial revision. The nutritionist who changed her mind is one of the more important and least celebrated figures in the story of American food, because her change of mind represented something that institutional science finds genuinely difficult: the public acknowledgement that a confident position, held for decades and used to reshape the diets of millions of people, turned out to be wrong in important ways. The reversal on trans fats was perhaps the clearest and most consequential. Researchers who had spent the 1960s and 70s recommending the replacement of saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat, including the partially hydrogenated vegetable oils that produce trans fatty acids as a byproduct, were, by the 1990s, confronted with evidence that the recommendation had caused harm. The trans fats in margarine raised bad cholesterol, lowered good cholesterol, and were associated with cardiovascular outcomes worse than those produced by the saturated fat they had replaced. The recommendation to switch from butter to margarine had, for a significant portion of the population, made the problem it was designed to solve worse. This is the kind of finding that a scientist is trained to accept and update on. The evidence changed, the conclusion should change accordingly. In practice, the update was slow and uncomfortable. Careers had been built on the saturated fat hypothesis. Guidelines had been issued. Public health campaigns had been run. The food industry had reformulated products in response to recommendations that were now being revised. Acknowledging the revision required acknowledging that the original confidence had exceeded the evidence, that the certainty with which butter had been condemned and margarine endorsed had been in part a performance of confidence that the underlying research did not fully support. Some researchers made the acknowledgement clearly and on the record. Others revised their positions in the language of nuance. The picture is more complex than previously understood, which is accurate but which does not quite convey to the public that what was previously presented as settled science had turned out to be a more contested question than the presentation suggested. The public, for its part, received the revision with the particular frustration of people who had been told one thing confidently for decades and were now being told something different, also confidently, by the same kinds of experts. The frustration was understandable. It also did not help. What the nutritionist who changed her mind teaches us, if we are paying attention, is not that nutrition science is useless, or that dietary recommendations should be ignored. It is that confidence in nutritional claims should be proportional to the strength of the evidence, and that the strength of the evidence in nutritional science is often considerably lower than the confidence of the public communication suggests. The margarine story produced a generation of confused consumers, not because the scientists were dishonest, but because the translation of uncertain research into public health messaging tended to remove the uncertainty. The uncertainty was the important part. It was also the part that did not fit in a 30-second television spot, and so it was left out, and its absence cost something that took a long time to fully calculate. So tonight, as you lie in your clean bed, in your warm house, with a refrigerator full of food whose ingredients you could, if you wanted to, actually look up, take a quiet moment to think about the women who stood in the kitchens of 1955 and did their best with what they were given. They were not fooled, exactly. They were persuaded. And there is a difference. Persuasion requires participation. It requires a person who is trying to do the right thing, who is listening to the authority she has been given reason to trust, who is making choices not out of ignorance, but out of the very human desire to take care of the people she loves with the best available information. The women who switched from butter to margarine in the 1950s were doing that. They were listening, they were updating, they were, in the language of the era, being modern. That they were being modern in a direction that a corporation had carefully arranged for them does not make them naive. It makes them human, which is something else entirely. The Margarine story is not a story about villains, though it has people in it who behaved badly. It is not a story about foolish consumers, though it has moments of collective credulity that are uncomfortable to examine. It is a story about the gap between confidence and knowledge, about what happens when the certainty with which information is delivered runs ahead of the certainty of the information itself, and about how long it takes for that gap to close when there are commercial interests on one side and institutional pride on the other. The gap closed eventually. The trans fats came off the label, then out of the product. The dietary guidelines were revised. The butter, quietly and without formal ceremony, was rehabilitated. The tub of margarine still sits in the dairy case, reformulated, relabeled, making more careful claims than it once did. And somewhere in the same case, a few feet away, the butter sits in its gold foil wrapper, older than every other product on the shelf, having outlasted the consensus that was supposed to replace it. History does not always move in straight lines. Sometimes it moves in the shape of a question that takes 50 years to answer, and by the time the answer arrives, an entire generation has already eaten breakfast. So tonight, whatever is in your refrigerator, whatever you spread on your toast in the morning, rest easy. You're better informed than your grandmother was. The labels are more honest than they used to be. The science, while still imperfect and still contested in places, is more complete. And the story of how the American kitchen was reshaped by a tub of pale yellow fat, a packet of dye, and an extraordinarily confident advertising industry is now yours to carry with you, which means you carry it with a little more clarity than the women who lived through it, without knowing they were living through history. They were resilient, those women. They cooked dinner every night under fluorescent supermarket lights and television authority and the quiet pressure of being modern in a decade that had very specific ideas about what modern meant. They fed their families and they kept their households and they made the best choices they could see to make. That some of those choices were arranged for them by people with other interests does not diminish the love that went into the making of them. Because history may be complicated, and nutrition science may be humbling, and the gap between what we're told and what is true may be wider than we're comfortable admitting. But people, stubborn, hopeful, breakfast-making people, keep going anyway. One morning at a time, one piece of toast at a time, doing their best with what they know, waiting for the rest to catch up. Sleep well,